The borough of Wigan has been home to hundreds of spectacular women throughout history, but the way that we've recorded and celebrated their histories has not been the same as the way we've recorded and celebrated men's. Many archive sources are written down, and teaching women how to read and write wasn't considered a priority for education for a long time in history. It wasn't until the 17th century that the first boarding schools for girls were set up, and it wasn't until under 200 years ago that the first colleges for women at universities came into existence. And even with boarding schools and with women's colleges, these were only really accessible to women and families who could afford to pay for them. So in an archive full of written sources, how do we find women's stories in their own words? We're lucky enough here at Archives Wigan Leigh to look after some of the diaries and letters of a woman called Ellen Weeton. Ellen was a remarkable and tenacious woman who lived from the late 1700s to the mid 1800s all over the northwest of England. These diaries are important because they help us to understand what life was really like for a woman of her standing living at this time. The beauty of using a diary as a collection is you get a really good feel for this person as an individual. You get their first-hand thoughts. Diaries and letters aren't written for a wider audience. They're written for close friends and mainly just herself. So they give you a really interesting insight into what someone actually was like. What we find with Ellen's diary is that she doesn't always come across as nice, but who is nice every day of their lives. What we find really is that Ellen is honest, and she's writing at a time where her circumstances are quite constrained. So maybe her diaries and her letters are one of the few places that she can express herself fully.
Two young women came to spend the day with Mrs. Smith. Have several times when I passed through the kitchen to prepare my dinner and tea, observed, it must be very dull to spend so much time by myself. Poor girls! They are not capable of knowing how great is the enjoyment of some hours in solitude, to a mind accustomed to it, and by education fitted for it.
Ellen was born in Upholland on the edge of Lancashire in 1776 to parents Captain Thomas Weeton and Mother Mary Rawlinson. Now, Captain Thomas Weeton named Ellen Nellie, actually, somewhat inauspiciously after a vessel that he captained during either the American War of Independence or as part of the African slave trade. Captain Thomas Weeton was killed in action during the American War for Independence, and the company he worked for never paid out, which left his wife and children with very little money to survive on. Ellen grew up in Upholland on the edge of Lancashire and Wigan at a time when it was considered needless to expend money on educating young women. And yet, Ellen's thirst for learning seems to be one of her biggest joys in life. Unfortunately, her mother Mary thought that Ellen would be ruined for any useful purpose in life should her inclination for learning be indulged. Ellen longed to go to school like her younger brother, Thomas, but unfortunately she wasn't allowed. She stayed at home with her mother, who taught a local dame's school for local children, and this was where she got her first taste for learning.
When my brother was away and my mother too busy to attend to me, I had no resource but reading and scribbling, for I was a scribbler, in chalk or even with a pen. Before I was taught to write, I was, from 2 years old, always fond of books.
Ellen took over her mother's school business when she was 21 years old. This was to be able to ensure that her brother Thomas could finish his training to become a solicitor. She later then took on work as a governess, educating the children of wealthier families. And her work took her from Upholland to Liverpool to Kendal and travelling all over the country. Her skill in education opened up a career that allowed her to travel throughout the British Isles. Another interesting insight that we get from using a diary is that we get this amazing contrast of narratives between her personal thoughts and the better recorded narrative of her controlling husband, Aaron Stock. He was the owner of a local cotton mill who lived in Wigan, and they married in 1814. They lived together on Chapel Lane in Wigan, behind the factory that her husband owned. Now, we know from her diary entries that he was very often abusive, denying her access to food and water, not allowing her to leave her room, And in 1821, we can see that he was arrested for assault on his wife, and she was known then Nellie Stock. Eventually, through much tenacity and fighting from Ellen, she was able to obtain an act of separation between herself and her abusive husband. But unfortunately, this wasn't a great arrangement. This meant that she had to banish herself from Wigan, and this wouldn't have been very pleasant for her, as it meant that she could only see the daughter that herself and Aaron had together 3 times a year.
I have expected to hear from you for some weeks past, and wonder why you have never written to me. Write soon, my love, if Mrs. Grundy will permit you. Or shall I think you want to forget your mother? The sight of a letter by your dear little hand would be a great comfort to me, and I hope I shall see one in a few days after you receive this. If Mary is at Parr Hall, I must consider some method of proceeding different to this which I have pursued for so many months, of being patient and submissive. My spirits are exceedingly depressed. I think I shall quite sink unless I can see my child.